The sound of boots on concrete made me freeze mid-wrench turn. I did not look up immediately. Something in my gut told me this was not a friendly visit. When I finally raised my eyes from the motorcycle engine, Sheriff Sheila was already 8 feet inside my garage, scanning my workbench like she owned the place. Her hand rested casually on her holster as she picked up a container of engine degreaser with her free hand. Storing hazardous chemicals in an unsecured location is a violation, she said, not even bothering to introduce herself or explain why she was in my private property. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "Do you have a warrant to be in here?" She laughed, not a chuckle or a polite response, a dismissive laugh that made my blood run cold. "I do not need one," she replied, continuing her unauthorized inspection. "Consider this a friendly visit, for now." That was the moment I realized Sheriff Sheila was not enforcing the law. She was above it, and no one was stopping her. My garage had been my sanctuary for decades. After 35 years working as a structural engineer, I had finally retired last spring, trading spreadsheets and stress for socket wrenches and solitude. The first thing I did was clear out the clutter, install proper lighting, and set up my dream workshop. This was not just a hobby. Restoring vintage motorcycles had been my passion since college, but life, career, and family obligations had relegated it to occasional weekends. Now it was my daily purpose. The neighbors knew me as the motorcycle guy. I was not particularly social, but I was friendly. I would wave when cars passed by, chat briefly about the weather or local happenings when someone walked their dog past my driveway. Most days, I kept the garage door wide open, letting in fresh air and natural light while classic rock played from an old stereo in the corner. The gentle rumble of engines being tuned was my meditation. That Tuesday afternoon had started like any other. I was working on a 1978 Honda CB 750, a four-cylinder beauty that had been neglected for years before I rescued it from a barn sale. The engine was apart on my workbench, and I was carefully inspecting each valve and spring. My hands were streaked with grease, and I had been at it for hours, lost in the meticulous work that brought me such peace. I did not notice the police cruiser until it was already idling in front of my house. The white and green vehicle with the county sheriff's logo stood out starkly against the quiet suburban backdrop. I glanced up briefly, assuming it would continue down the street. When it stopped instead, I thought perhaps they were responding to a call nearby or looking for an address. I returned my attention to the motorcycle parts spread before me. Then came the sound of a car door closing, followed by purposeful footsteps approaching my driveway. I looked up again and saw her for the first time, Sheriff Sheila herself, not a deputy. I recognized her from the local paper and town meetings, though we had never spoken directly. She was tall, with graying hair pulled back severely, her uniform pressed and perfect. Her expression was unreadable as she surveyed my property. What happened next still fills me with indignation when I recall it. Without a word of greeting, without asking permission, she walked directly into my garage as if it were a public sidewalk. Her boots made sharp sounds against the concrete floor as she moved past the threshold that separated my private property from the outside world. "Afternoon," she finally said, already examining my workbench and the parts laid out there. "We have received complaints about noise and possible hazardous material storage." I straightened up slowly, wiping my hands on a shop rag. My heart was beating faster, though at that moment I attributed it to surprise rather than the violation that was occurring. "Sheriff," I said politely though confused, "I was not aware of any complaints. Who reported this issue?" She did not answer my question. Instead, she continued moving through my space, picking up containers, examining labels, making notes on a small pad she pulled from her breast pocket. She paused at a shelf where I kept various fluids: oil, transmission fluid, brake fluid, all properly sealed and organized. "Do you have proper permits for an automotive repair business?" she asked, still writing. "This is not a business," I explained, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with her presence and line of questioning. "These are personal projects. I am retired and restore motorcycles as a hobby." Sheriff Sheila made a non-committal sound, neither accepting nor rejecting my explanation. She moved toward the back of the garage where I kept larger tools and equipment. My discomfort grew with every step she took deeper into my space. "The noise from your hobby has been noted by residents, and storage of these substances requires proper ventilation and safety protocols," she said, gesturing vaguely around the garage. It was then that I realized something was fundamentally wrong with this interaction. I had lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. My neighbors and I had good relationships. If there had been an issue with noise, someone would have mentioned it to me directly before involving law enforcement. Moreover, I was meticulous about safety and cleanliness in my workspace. "Sheriff," I said more firmly this time, "may I ask if you have a warrant to enter and search my garage?" She turned to face me fully for the first time, her expression hardening slightly. There was something in her eyes that went beyond professional authority, something personal and cold that made me instinctively wary. "I am conducting a safety inspection based on a community complaint," she replied, emphasizing each word as if explaining something simple to a child. "When there is potential hazard or nuisance, I have authority to investigate without delay." I knew enough about basic constitutional rights to recognize this was not accurate, but challenging a sheriff directly in my own garage suddenly seemed unwise. Something told me to proceed carefully. I would address this properly later. "I understand," I said, though I did not, "but I would appreciate knowing the nature of these complaints so I can address them appropriately." Sheriff Sheila closed her notepad with a snap. "You will receive written notification of any violations," she said curtly. Then, without further explanation or a proper goodbye, she walked back through the garage and to her waiting cruiser. I stood in silence as she drove away, the sound of my radio suddenly noticeable again in the quiet she left behind. My sanctuary had been invaded, and the violation left me feeling unsettled in a space that had always represented freedom and peace. The cruiser disappeared around the corner, but the disturbance Sheriff Sheila had created lingered like a bad odor. I found myself unable to return to the motorcycle engine. My focus was shattered. Each tool I picked up felt wrong in my hands, my movements mechanical rather than intuitive. After 30 minutes of distracted attempts, I put everything down and decided to speak with my neighbors. Martin and Alina Walsh had lived next door for 15 years. Martin was retired like me, a former high school physics teacher who now spent his days tending an elaborate garden. If anyone would have complaints about noise, it would logically be them, as their property shared the closest boundary to my garage. I walked over and found Martin pruning roses near their fence. He smiled and waved as I approached. "Martin," I said after exchanging pleasantries, "I just had Sheriff Sheila come by. She mentioned noise complaints about my garage work. Have I been disturbing you and Alina?" Martin's expression shifted from friendly to confused. "Noise complaints? From us?" He shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. We hardly hear anything from your place, and what we do hear is just normal neighborhood sounds. Besides, we would have talked to you directly if there was ever an issue." "So you did not file a complaint with the sheriff's office?" I asked to confirm. "Good Lord, no," Martin replied, looking genuinely troubled. That would be extreme even if there was a problem, which there is not. Did she say it was us specifically? I explained that Sheriff Sheila had not identified the source of the complaints, just that they existed. Martin seemed increasingly concerned as I described her entering my garage without permission and her dismissive attitude when I questioned her authority to do so. "That does not sound right," he said finally. "Eleanor's cousin is an attorney. You might want to ask about the legality of entering your garage without permission or a warrant." I thanked Martin and continued down the street, speaking with 3 other neighbors whose properties were close enough to potentially be affected by noise from my garage. Each conversation yielded the same result. No one had complained. All expressed surprise at the sheriff's visit, and several seemed troubled by the notion that she had entered my property without clear cause or permission. By the time I returned home, my confusion had transformed into something sharper, indignation bordering on anger. I sat at my kitchen table and composed a formal complaint to the sheriff's office, detailing the incident with precise times, quotes, and concerns about constitutional rights and proper procedure. I described how Sheriff Sheila had entered without consent, made vague accusations without evidence, and refused to properly identify the source of complaints. I printed the letter, signed it, and drove directly to the sheriff's department to file it officially. The deputy at the front desk took my complaint with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been boredom. He assured me it would be processed according to procedure. When I asked what that procedure entailed and when I might expect a response, his answers became vague and non-committal. "These things take time," he said, not meeting my eyes. "The sheriff will review it when she has opportunity." I left feeling distinctly that my complaint would be filed directly into oblivion. Still, I had made a record, which seemed important for reasons I could not yet fully articulate. 3 weeks passed with no response from the sheriff's office. No citation arrived in my mail as Sheriff Sheila had implied it might. I had begun to think perhaps the incident was isolated, a random power play or misunderstanding that would not repeat itself. I returned to my routine, though I now found myself listening for cruisers and instinctively tensing at unexpected sounds outside. Then one afternoon, while picking up groceries at the local market, I ran into Hank Williams, who owned the auto repair shop on Main Street. We knew each other casually through our shared interest in engines and mechanics. As we chatted in the produce section, I mentioned my strange encounter with Sheriff Sheila. Hank's usual jovial expression darkened. "She pulled that same stunt at my shop last year," he said, lowering his voice though no one was nearby. "Walked right into my back storage area claiming she had reports of improper waste disposal. No warrant, no advance notice." "Did you file a complaint?" I asked. "I did, fat lot of good it did." Hank shook his head. "Never heard back. But 2 weeks later, I got hit with 3 separate code violations for things that had never been issues in 15 years of business inspections. Cost me nearly $4,000 in fines and required modifications." He leaned closer. "Listen, between us, do not push back against her, it only gets worse. That is what everyone says." That conversation with Hank stayed with me as I drove home. What had felt like an isolated incident now appeared to be something else entirely, a pattern of behavior, a system. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. When I arrived home, there was an official envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a citation for improper storage of hazardous materials and operating commercial activities in a residential zone, with a fine of $750 and requirements for immediate remediation. The form was signed by Sheriff Sheila personally. I stood in my driveway, reading and rereading the citation with growing disbelief. This was not about noise complaints. This was not about safety. This was about power and its abuse. And it was becoming increasingly clear that Sheriff Sheila exercised that power without accountability or oversight. The citation in my hand represented more than just a financial penalty. It was a message. Sheriff Sheila was letting me know that questioning her authority had consequences. Despite Hank's warning, I found myself unwilling to simply accept this abuse of power. The engineer in me needed data, patterns, confirmation that what I suspected was actually occurring. I began my research methodically. First, I expanded my conversations beyond immediate neighbors to include others throughout the community. I framed my questions carefully, not wanting to lead people toward particular answers or create the impression I was simply gathering complaints. I asked about interactions with local law enforcement, experiences with property inspections, and knowledge of enforcement patterns. Most conversations were brief and yielded little useful information. Many people seemed reluctant to discuss the sheriff's department at all, which was itself revealing. But occasionally, someone would share an experience that aligned with my own. Marjorie Fielding, who ran a small art studio from her converted garage, described how Sheriff Sheila had entered her backyard workshop during a class with students present, citing anonymous complaints about commercial activity in a residential area. She made me feel like a criminal in front of my students, Marjorie told me, her voice still tight with anger months after the incident. I have had proper permits for 5 years. She knew that. She just wanted to establish dominance. Marjorie had been fined $500 for inadequate parking provisions, despite the fact that all her students parked legally on the street, as permitted by local ordinances. Richard Taverner from the other side of town reported that Sheriff Sheila had walked into his basement home brewery, entering through an unlocked back door without knocking, claiming she was investigating reports of illegal alcohol distribution. Richard, who made small batches of craft beer as a hobby and occasionally shared them with friends, found himself with a citation for unlicensed manufacturing that took months and an attorney to resolve. With each story, the pattern became clearer. Sheriff Sheila routinely entered private property without warrants or permission. She cited vague complaints that could never be verified. Those who questioned her authority or filed complaints about her conduct subsequently faced escalated enforcement actions, often on unrelated matters. The message was consistent. Compliance without question was the only safe path. I took my investigation further, visiting the county records office to review public documents. I requested records of citations, complaints, and enforcement actions over the past 3 years. The clerk seemed nervous when I mentioned Sheriff Sheila specifically, but provided the publicly available documents as required by law. What I found in those records confirmed my suspicions. During Sheriff Sheila's tenure, there had been a 340% increase in citations for code violations in residential areas compared to the previous sheriff's administration. There was a clear pattern of escalation. Initial citations followed by more serious ones if the recipient contested the first. More troubling, I found 12 instances where residents had filed official complaints against Sheriff Sheila for procedural violations, and in 11 of those cases, the complainants subsequently received multiple citations within weeks of their complaints. I also discovered online forums where residents of our county and neighboring areas discussed local issues. In one thread titled "Dealing with Local Authorities," I found dozens of comments specifically mentioning Sheriff Sheila and experiences similar to mine. Many used pseudonyms and spoke in careful terms, but the pattern was unmistakable. Sheriff S. entered my greenhouse without permission or warning. Got fined after questioning why she was in my garage. Filed complaint, then suddenly had 3 deputies inspecting my property the next week. One comment particularly stood out. She's not enforcing laws, she's enforcing her authority. Big difference. I began keeping a detailed log of everything I learned: dates, names, incidents, patterns. I recorded my own experience in minute detail, including exact quotes and timestamps. I noted the timing between my complaint and the citation I received. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not a series of isolated incidents, but rather a systemic abuse of power. What troubled me most was not just Sheriff Sheila's behavior, but the silence that surrounded it. People were afraid. They paid unjust fines rather than fight. They endured violations of their rights rather than challenge authority. And in that silence, her power had grown unchecked. One night, as I reviewed my growing collection of evidence, I realized I had crossed a threshold. This was no longer just about defending my rights. It had become about something larger. Someone needed to stand up to Sheriff Sheila, to challenge this abuse of power before it became so entrenched that it could not be dislodged. Despite the risk, despite Hank's warning, I decided that someone would be me. The retaliation began subtly at first. 3 days after I filed my complaint and began asking questions around town, I noticed the sheriff's cruiser driving slowly past my house. This was not the routine patrol that occasionally passed through our neighborhood. This was deliberate, a crawling drive-by with Sheriff Sheila clearly visible behind the wheel, her gaze fixed on my property. The first time I dismissed it as coincidence. By the 4th consecutive day of these slow patrols, the message was unmistakable. I was being watched. The knowledge settled in my stomach like a cold stone. I found myself increasingly hesitant to spend time in my garage with the door open. My sanctuary was transforming into a fishbowl. 10 days after my initial complaint, a different kind of official envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one contained a citation for excessive yard waste accumulation, with a fine of $250. I stood in my driveway, looking at my meticulously maintained lawn in disbelief. The citation referenced leaf and branch debris exceeding permitted volume, but included no photographic evidence or specific measurements. 2 days later, another citation arrived, this one for improper placement of waste receptacles visible from public right-of-way. My trash and recycling bins, which had been in the same discreet location beside my garage for years, were suddenly in violation of a county ordinance I had never heard of. Another $150 fine. The pattern was precise and calculated. Each citation addressed issues that were subjective, difficult to disprove, and unrelated to my original complaint about Sheriff Sheila's warrantless entry. Each came with substantial fines and vague requirements for correction that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Each reminded me that Sheriff Sheila had the machinery of local government at her disposal, while I had only my determination and growing sense of outrage. My neighbors noticed the increased police presence. Several stopped speaking to me altogether, crossing the street when they saw me outside or suddenly becoming busy with yard work when I approached. Fear was contagious, and I had become a carrier of something dangerous attention from Sheriff Sheila. Only Martin remained openly friendly, though even he lowered his voice when we spoke. "This is not right," he said one evening, glancing nervously toward the street as we talked over the fence. "Alina says you should document everything. Take photos of your yard, your bins, everything they are citing you for." I had already begun doing exactly that. Each day, I photographed my property from multiple angles. I kept meticulous records of the cruiser drive-bys, noting times and frequency. I recorded dates and details of each citation, cross-referencing the cited ordinances with official county code. I was building a case, though I was not yet certain how or where I would present it. The confrontation at the grocery store caught me by surprise. I was selecting produce when Deputy Carson, Sheriff Sheila's most loyal officer, appeared beside me. He did not greet me. He simply stood close enough that our shoulders nearly touched and spoke without looking at me directly. "Sheriff asked me to remind you about regulations regarding flammable liquid storage in residential structures," he said, voice pitched low but intense. "Violations can result in immediate property seizure under hazardous materials protocols." Before I could respond, he moved away, leaving me holding a bell pepper that suddenly felt heavy in my hand. The implied threat was clear. Sheriff Sheila could escalate beyond citations to actual seizure of property. My garage, my motorcycles, my tools, all could be taken under the guise of safety violations. That evening, I made two significant decisions. First, I installed security cameras covering my driveway, garage, and the street frontage of my property. The system included motion detection and cloud storage of footage, evidence that could not be seized or destroyed. Second, I drafted a formal complaint to the County Oversight Board, bypassing the Sheriff's Department entirely. This second complaint was more comprehensive than my first. It detailed not just the initial warrantless entry, but the pattern of retaliatory citations and surveillance that followed. I included photographs of my property disproving the citation claims, logs of the cruiser drive-bys, and a transcript of Deputy Carson's veiled threat. I also referenced similar experiences reported by other residents, though I was careful not to name individuals without their permission. 3 days after installing the cameras, they captured exactly what I had anticipated. Sheriff Sheila herself, walking slowly past my property at 7:15 a.m. when most neighbors were still inside preparing for work. She paused directly in front of my driveway, made notes in her small pad, and took photographs with her phone. She never approached the house or made any attempt to speak with me. This was surveillance, plain and simple. That footage became the final attachment to my complaint to the Oversight Board. I delivered it personally to the County Administration Building, obtaining a receipt and confirmation number. As I left the building, I felt a curious mix of apprehension and relief. I had escalated the conflict significantly. Sheriff Sheila would inevitably learn of this second complaint, and her retaliation would likely intensify. Yet I also felt something I had not experienced since this began, a sense of taking back control. I was no longer merely reacting to her intimidation tactics. I was building a case methodically and carefully. I was creating a record that could not be ignored or dismissed. Most importantly, I was refusing to be silenced by fear. That night, I reopened my garage door for the first time in weeks. I turned on my music, pulled the tarp off the Honda CB 750, and returned to the restoration work that brought me joy. My cameras were recording. My documentation was thorough. Sheriff Sheila might continue her campaign against me, but I would no longer hide in my own home. Sometimes standing your ground is its own form of victory, however small and temporary. The County Oversight Board's response came more quickly than I had anticipated. 2 weeks after filing my complaint, I received a letter acknowledging receipt and indicating that the matter has been referred to legal counsel for review. The letter was bureaucratically vague, but represented something significant: official recognition that my concerns warranted examination. With this small validation, I decided to consult an attorney of my own. Eliner's cousin had provided a referral to James Widhaker, an attorney specializing in constitutional law and civil rights violations. His office was in the neighboring county, which seemed prudent given Sheriff Sheila's influence in our local legal community. I arrived at our appointment with an organized binder containing all my documentation, photographs, citation copies, security footage, complaint records, and the log of similar incidents reported by others. James reviewed the materials silently, his expression growing increasingly serious as he progressed through the evidence. "What you have here," he said finally, looking up from the binder, "is a textbook case of Fourth Amendment violations combined with First Amendment retaliation." He tapped the security footage still frame showing Sheriff Sheila standing in front of my property. "This is not law enforcement. This is intimidation." "Do I have a valid legal case?" I asked. James nodded slowly. "More than valid. From what you have shown me, Sheriff Sheila entered your garage without a warrant, without probable cause, and without your consent. That alone is a clear constitutional violation. The pattern of selective enforcement and surveillance that followed your complaint constitutes retaliatory action against protected speech. Both are actionable civil rights violations." He explained that while individual citations might be technically defensible based on strict interpretations of local ordinances, the pattern of enforcement revealed a clear retaliatory motive that undermined their legitimacy. More importantly, the warrantless entry into my garage was, in his words, indefensible under any reasonable interpretation of Fourth Amendment protections. "Your garage is not a public space," James explained. "It is part of your home's curtilage, the area immediately surrounding your dwelling that carries an expectation of privacy. Law enforcement cannot enter without a warrant, consent, or exigent circumstances like imminent danger. A vague noise complaint does not remotely qualify as exigent." For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the weight of uncertainty lifting. My instincts had been correct. My rights had indeed been violated, and there was a legal pathway to address that violation. "What would pursuing this case involve?" I asked. James outlined a process that would begin with a formal notice of intent to file a civil rights lawsuit against Sheriff Sheila, both in her official capacity and as an individual. This distinction was important, he explained, because it would prevent her from claiming qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that protects government officials from personal liability unless they violate clearly established rights. The Fourth Amendment protection against warrantless searches is about as clearly established as law gets, James noted with grim satisfaction. And we have video evidence of her retaliatory actions. This is not a case where qualified immunity should apply. He cautioned that the process would not be quick or easy. Sheriff Sheila would have institutional support from the county. There would be attempts to discredit me, to portray my complaints as those of a disgruntled citizen with an agenda. The citations against me might increase before they stopped. "Are you prepared for that?" he asked directly. I considered the question carefully. The past months had already shown me what Sheriff Sheila was capable of: the intimidation, the selective enforcement, the quiet pressure applied through official channels. Fighting back would likely intensify those tactics before it ended them. Yet something fundamental had shifted in me since that first day she walked uninvited into my garage. This was no longer just about defending my rights as an individual. It was about challenging a pattern of abuse that affected the entire community. If no one stood up to this behavior, it would continue indefinitely, perhaps worsen over time. "Yes," I replied, "I am prepared." In the days that followed, James helped me refine my documentation and build a stronger timeline of events. He suggested reaching out, carefully and through him, to others who had experienced similar treatment from Sheriff Sheila. Those willing to provide affidavits would strengthen our case substantially by establishing a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. Through an encrypted email account James set up for this purpose, we contacted individuals I had identified during my research. The responses were illuminating. Many expressed fear of retaliation and declined to participate formally. But 7 people agreed to provide sworn statements describing their experiences with Sheriff Sheila's warrantless entries and subsequent intimidation tactics. Their stories formed a disturbing mosaic: a small business owner whose storage room was searched without permission, a homeowner whose greenhouse was entered while she was away, a retired teacher whose workshop was inspected without a warrant. Each account reinforced the others, creating a picture of systematic constitutional violations spanning years. James incorporated these affidavits into a comprehensive legal framework. Our case would argue that Sheriff Sheila had engaged in a pattern of Fourth Amendment violations through warrantless searches of private property, followed by First Amendment violations through retaliatory enforcement actions against those who questioned her authority. As we finalized the draft complaint, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: apprehension about the conflict ahead, determination to see this through, and something unexpected: hope. For the first time since Sheriff Sheila walked into my garage, I believed there might be accountability, that the system designed to protect individual rights might actually function as intended. "We file next week," James said as we concluded our final preparatory meeting. "Are you ready for this to become public?" I nodded. I have been ready since she crossed my threshold without permission. Some lines should not be crossed, especially by those sworn to uphold the law. I stared at my computer screen, the cursor blinking next to the post button. The video footage of Sheriff Sheila walking into my garage played in another window, clear evidence of her violation. My attorney Marcus leaned over my shoulder, nodding his approval. "This is how we create accountability," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "Your story deserves to be heard." My hand trembled slightly as I clicked post. The moment felt monumental, like opening a door that could never be closed again. Within minutes, the notifications began. First a trickle, then a flood. "She did the same thing to me last summer," wrote a woman from Oak Ridge Lane. "Sheila walked straight into my backyard workshop without a word," commented a carpenter from the west side of town. By evening, the post had reached well beyond our town borders. People from neighboring counties shared it, adding their own encounters. Marcus called me around 9 that night, his voice charged with energy. "This is bigger than we thought, much bigger. The stories are consistent: pattern of behavior, abuse of power, clear constitutional violations. We have hit a nerve." I could barely sleep that night. My phone vibrated constantly with alerts, messages, and comments. Some offered support. Others shared their own stories of Sheila's intrusions. A few contained threats, warning me to back down. I saved those for Marcus. The following morning, my doorbell rang at 7. I expected Sheila or one of her deputies. Instead, I found a young woman with a press badge and a digital recorder. "Mr. Evans, I am Diane Mercer from the County Herald. I would like to ask you about the allegations against Sheriff Sheila Wilson." I invited her in cautiously, recounting my experience while she recorded. Her questions were precise, focused on dates, times, and specifics. When I showed her the footage, she watched it 3 times, taking detailed notes. "This is significant," she said simply. 2 days later, her article ran across the front page. "Sheriff accused of warrantless entry. Pattern of constitutional violations alleged." The County Herald was not a large publication, but it was respected. County officials read it. State officials read it. By noon, my phone rang with a call from County Commissioner Hargrove. "We have received numerous inquiries about this situation," he said, his political caution evident in every carefully chosen word. "The council believes it prudent to address these allegations in a formal setting. We are scheduling a public hearing for next Tuesday at 7 p.m. I thanked him, hiding my surprise. Things were moving faster than I had anticipated. That evening, Marcus and I met at his office to prepare. "This is not just about you anymore," he said, spreading printouts of comments and messages across his desk. "This is about dozens of people whose rights were violated. The pressure is building. Sheila's superiors cannot ignore this now." The hearing was announced officially the next morning. Local news picked it up immediately. By the weekend, a regional television station ran a segment about small-town policing practices under scrutiny. They showed my garage footage, blurring my face but clearly showing Sheila entering without permission. People began approaching me in grocery stores, at gas stations, and on sidewalks. Some whispered quick thanks. Others shared their own stories. A few warned me to be careful. I installed additional cameras around my property that weekend. On Monday, the day before the hearing, 3 more people contacted Marcus, asking to join our case. Each had documentation, photos, citations issued after questioning Sheila's authority, even a recording of her entering a greenhouse without permission. "Tomorrow will change everything," Marcus said, as we finalized our presentation for the hearing. "Are you ready for this to become very public?" I thought about my quiet life before all this began. The motorcycles, the peace of my garage, the simple routine of retirement. That life seemed distant now, replaced by a purpose I had never anticipated. "I am ready," I told him, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Someone needs to show her that a badge does not erase the Constitution. That night I stood in my garage looking at the spot where Sheila had first crossed my threshold. The violation felt as fresh as the day it happened. But now I was no longer just angry. I was determined. The public was watching. The system was responding. And tomorrow Sheila would face the first real challenge to her authority in years. I closed my garage door that night with a different feeling than ever before. Not fear, not anger, but resolution. The spotlight was about to shine on years of abuse, and I had helped create that light. The county council chambers filled quickly that Tuesday evening. I arrived early with Marcus, watching as every seat was taken. Additional chairs were brought in. Still, people lined the walls. Camera flashes periodically lit the room as local reporters gathered in the designated press area. Commissioner Hargrove opened the session precisely at 7, his gavel echoing through the suddenly quiet room. He explained the purpose of the hearing with careful neutrality, emphasizing that no final decisions would be made that evening. This was information gathering, he insisted. Sheriff Sheila sat with her attorney at a table to our right. She wore her full uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her expression remained impassive, but I noticed her eyes darting occasionally toward the crowd, perhaps looking for friendly faces. "We will begin with testimony from the primary complainant," Hargrove announced, nodding toward me. Marcus squeezed my shoulder as I approached the podium. The microphone amplified my breathing as I arranged my notes. I looked up, facing the council members directly. "My name is Joseph Evans," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "On March 12th, Sheriff Wilson entered my garage without permission, without a warrant, and without probable cause." I methodically presented my timeline, describing the encounter in detail. Council members leaned forward when I mentioned my security footage. When Marcus played the video on the chamber's projection system, the room fell completely silent. The footage was unmistakable, Sheila walking directly into my open garage, bypassing the invisible but constitutionally significant threshold between public and private property. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the date and time. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches, I continued after the video ended. Sheriff Wilson violated that protection, not just in my case but in many others. Commissioner Tate, a former prosecutor, asked me several pointed questions about whether I had invited Sheila in or given any form of consent. I answered clearly, no. After my testimony, others came forward. A woman named Elena described Sheila entering her greenhouse during a family gathering. She claimed she smelled marijuana, Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. There was none. We were growing heirloom tomatoes. She searched everything anyway, frightening my grandchildren. A local mechanic testified about Sheila entering his workshop without permission, claiming anonymous complaints about stolen car parts. A teacher described Sheila walking into her backyard studio unannounced, citing noise violations despite no nearby neighbors. With each testimony, the pattern became clearer. The council members exchanged increasingly troubled glances. When Sheila finally took the podium, her demeanor remained confident. She adjusted her uniform before speaking. These accusations mischaracterize standard public safety procedures, she stated firmly. As sheriff, I am responsible for responding to complaints and ensuring ordinance compliance. Open structures like garages and outbuildings visible from public areas fall under the plain view doctrine when violations are suspected. Her attorney nodded approvingly beside her, but Commissioner Tate leaned forward. Sheriff Wilson, are you suggesting that an open garage door constitutes an invitation for law enforcement to enter private property without a warrant? In cases where potential violations are visible, yes, she responded without hesitation. Marcus immediately requested permission to address this claim. When granted, he approached the podium with a printed copy of a Supreme Court ruling. The case of Florida v. Jardines specifically addresses this question, he stated. The court ruled that law enforcement officers need a warrant to enter the curtilage of a home, which includes attached garages, even when visible from public areas. He distributed copies to council members. Sheila's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. The turning point came when Marcus requested permission to play a compilation of footage from multiple residents. The brief video showed Sheila entering 5 different properties without permission over a 2-month period. Commissioner Hargrove called a brief recess after the video. When the council returned, their faces were noticeably more serious. Based on the testimony and evidence presented tonight, Hargrove announced, this council will refer this matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of possible civil rights violations. Additionally, we request the State Law Enforcement Standards Board conduct an independent investigation into these allegations. The room erupted in murmurs. Sheila's face finally betrayed emotion, a flash of anger quickly suppressed. As the hearing concluded, reporters surrounded me. Their questions blurred together. Marcus fielded most of them, speaking carefully about constitutional rights and accountability. That night, I watched the local news from my living room. The lead story showed me walking to the podium, followed by clips of the security footage. The reporter called it unprecedented scrutiny of local law enforcement practices. I turned off the television and sat in silence. Something fundamental had shifted. The private violation I had experienced had transformed into public accountability. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. Slowly, perhaps, but they were turning. 3 weeks after the hearing, Marcus filed our official lawsuit in federal district court. What began as my solitary stand had grown. 3 additional plaintiffs joined the case: Alina with her greenhouse intrusion, Raymond the mechanic, and Teresa the art teacher. Our names appeared side by side on the court documents: Evans et al. V. Wilson and Riverdale County. The filing made immediate waves. A regional news channel sent a crew to interview me on my front lawn. I chose my words carefully, speaking not about personal vendettas but constitutional principles. "This case is about establishing clear boundaries," I told the reporter. "A badge does not erase the Fourth Amendment." That evening, our lawsuit led the 6 o'clock news. Legal experts were interviewed, most acknowledging the strength of our evidence. One former prosecutor called the garage footage textbook violation of established Supreme Court precedent on curtilage protection. The morning after the news segment aired, Marcus called with significant news. The county executives had placed Sheila on administrative leave pending investigation. "They are distancing themselves," he explained. "They sense which way this is going." Deputy Chief Lawson assumed temporary command of the department. The following day, a different patrol car drove past my home, slower than necessary but without stopping. The message seemed clear: I was still being watched. Within a week, Sheila's attorney contacted Marcus with a settlement offer. The terms were straightforward: a modest payment to each plaintiff in exchange for dropping the case and signing non-disclosure agreements. Marcus called an immediate meeting at his office. "This is their first move," he explained, showing us the offer letter. "They want this to disappear quietly." Alina fidgeted with her glasses. "Is it a good offer?" "Financially, perhaps reasonable for a nuisance settlement," Marcus replied. "But it accomplishes nothing systemic. No admission of wrongdoing, no policy changes, no guarantees this stops happening to others." Raymond leaned forward in his chair. "I did not get involved for money. I joined because she walked into my shop like she owned it, then threatened my license when I objected." Teresa nodded firmly. "I vote we continue." I looked at each of their faces, these neighbors who had become allies in an unexpected fight. "I agree. This was never about compensation." Marcus drafted our rejection the same day. 2 days later, news broke that the state attorney general's office had launched a formal audit of the sheriff's department's search procedures and citation patterns over the past 5 years. The investigation moved with surprising speed. State officials requested records, interviewed deputies, and reviewed bodycam footage. One official quietly contacted Marcus, requesting copies of all evidence we had gathered from community members. Sheila remained conspicuously absent from public view. Her attorney issued brief statements about confidence in procedural review and mischaracterization of public safety practices. 6 weeks into the investigation, the preliminary findings leaked to local media. The report documented 47 instances of questionable warrantless entries over 3 years. Additionally, it revealed a pattern of retaliatory citations against those who questioned Sheila's authority. The county executives moved quickly. They extended Sheila's administrative leave indefinitely and scheduled an emergency session to review the findings. Our case proceeded through the legal system in parallel. The county filed motions to dismiss, which the judge promptly denied, citing the compelling and concerning visual evidence. Discovery began, with deputies being deposed about departmental practices. One junior deputy's testimony proved particularly damaging. Under oath, he admitted Sheila had instructed officers that open garages, workshops, and studios were fair game for entry if violations might be visible. 3 months after our filing, state officials released their full report. The conclusions were unambiguous: systematic disregard for established Fourth Amendment protections, and retaliatory pattern of enforcement against those who asserted constitutional rights. The following day, the county executives unanimously voted to remove Sheila from her position, effective immediately. The news reached me via text message from Marcus while I was working in my garage, the very space where it all began. I set down my wrench and walked to the threshold, looking out at the street where Sheila had once parked her cruiser. The victory felt significant but incomplete. Removal from office acknowledged the problem but did not fully address it. Our lawsuit continued, now focusing on establishing clear precedent and compensation for those who had suffered under her abuses of power. That evening, as the sun set, neighbors I barely knew before walked by my open garage. Some nodded, others stopped to talk. One elderly man shook my hand silently before continuing his walk. No words were necessary. The community understood what had been accomplished and what still remained to be done. The state investigation expanded beyond our initial expectations. What began as an examination of Sheila's warrantless entries grew into a comprehensive review of her entire tenure. Investigators pored through years of records, citations, complaints, and bodycam footage. Their findings, released in a 112-page report, painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuses. Beyond the unlawful entries, they documented evidence of selective enforcement, intimidation of critics, and fabrication of complaints to justify targeted harassment. In multiple instances, the report stated, Sheriff Wilson appears to have initiated investigations without legitimate complaints, particularly targeting residents who questioned her authority or refused compliance with questionable demands. The media coverage intensified. Regional newspapers ran feature stories. A national civil liberties organization issued a statement about using our case as an example of constitutional policing boundaries in small communities. Through it all, Sheila remained largely invisible to the public. Her attorney issued increasingly terse statements disputing the findings and claiming political motivation behind the investigation. For those who had experienced her intrusions, vindication came in waves. The county began reviewing citations and fines from Sheila's tenure. Dozens were voided. Refund checks arrived in mailboxes across town. Some came with official letters of apology from the county executives. Alina received notice that the illegal cultivation warning in her permanent record had been expunged. Raymond's business license complaints were dismissed. Teresa's noise violations vanished from county systems. As satisfying as these administrative corrections were, our lawsuit continued toward its inevitable conclusion. The county attorneys made increasingly desperate attempts to settle, each offer larger than the last. Each time we declined. This case must establish clear precedent, Marcus insisted during one negotiation session. Future sheriffs need to understand the constitutional boundaries of their authority. The deposition phase proved particularly revealing. Under oath, former deputies described an environment where challenging Sheila's methods was career suicide. One testified about being assigned to undesirable night shifts after questioning a warrantless entry. Another admitted to falsifying complaint records at Sheila's direction to justify targeted enforcement. The most damaging testimony came from a former administrative assistant. She described Sheila keeping a handwritten list of problem residents who had questioned her authority, a list that guided enforcement priorities. My name was probably at the top of that list, I remarked to Marcus after hearing this revelation. Without question, he agreed, you were the first to truly challenge her publicly. 9 months after filing our lawsuit, we finally received a trial date. The morning of court, I rose early, standing in my garage as dawn broke. I remembered that first encounter, the casual violation of my space, the dismissal of my rights, the beginning of retaliation. The memory still carried emotional weight, but now it was tempered with purpose. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. The judge, a former civil rights attorney appointed to the federal bench, watched attentively as Marcus presented our opening statement. The evidence unfolded methodically: testimony, documentation, and finally, the videos. My garage footage played on the courtroom monitor, followed by Eleanor's greenhouse entry, Raymond's workshop invasion, and Teresa's studio intrusion. The pattern was undeniable, the violations clear. Sheila took the stand on the third day, her uniform replaced by a conservative navy suit. Under direct examination from her attorney, she maintained that her actions were justified by public safety concerns and established department procedures. Under Marcus's cross-examination, however, her composure fractured. When presented with the Supreme Court precedent on curtilage protection, she claimed ignorance of the specific ruling. When shown the pattern of retaliatory citations, she insisted on coincidence. When confronted with the testimony about her problem residents list, she denied its existence entirely. Sheriff Wilson, Marcus asked in his final question, did you ever receive specific training on Fourth Amendment restrictions regarding warrantless entry to private property? Yes, she admitted reluctantly, during academy training and annual updates. No further questions, Marcus concluded, returning to our table. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. The courtroom fell silent as they filed back in, their faces solemn. The forewoman stood when prompted by the judge. On the claim of Fourth Amendment violations through warrantless entry, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge gavelled for silence. On the claim of retaliatory enforcement, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. The forewoman continued through each count. On every substantive claim, the verdict was the same, for the plaintiffs. When damages were announced, substantial for a small-town case, I felt no particular triumph. The money had never been the point. The true victory came with the judge's closing statement. He ordered the county to implement specific training programs on constitutional limitations of law enforcement authority. He mandated written confirmation before any entry to private property without a warrant. He required body cam activation for all civilian interactions. These systemic changes would long outlast any memory of our individual cases. As we left the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps. Marcus handled most questions, but one reporter directed a question specifically to me. Do you feel justice has been served? I paused, considering carefully. Justice is not just about one case or one verdict, I replied. It is about establishing boundaries that protect everyone, even those who never have to go to court. Today, those boundaries were reaffirmed. That is what matters most. Later that evening, alone in my garage, I turned on the radio to hear our case leading the local news. The reporter described it as a landmark ruling on small-town policing practices. Perhaps that was true, or perhaps it was simply a necessary correction, a reminder that authority requires accountability, regardless of badge or uniform. Either way, Sheila's reckoning had finally arrived, not through vengeance or retaliation, but through the steady application of constitutional principles and the courage of ordinary citizens who refused to be intimidated. The system had worked, slowly but decisively. Autumn arrived, painting the trees in vibrant colors and cooling the air. 6 months had passed since the verdict. The media attention had faded. The county had implemented the court-mandated reforms. A new sheriff had been appointed, a former state trooper with a reputation for professionalism and respect for procedure. I returned to my quiet routines. The motorcycles in my garage gradually transformed from rusted frames to gleaming machines. The settlement money remained largely untouched in a separate account. I had earmarked most of it for a legal defense fund for others facing similar situations. On a crisp Saturday morning, I worked with my garage door open as usual. The familiar sound of tires on gravel made me look up, momentarily tensing from old habit. But it was only my neighbor Thomas, stopping by with coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me a steaming cup. "Bike's looking good." He stayed for a while, leaning against the workbench. We talked about everyday things, weather, football, his daughter's college applications. Normal conversations that once seemed impossible during the tense months of surveillance and retaliation. "You know," Thomas said as he prepared to leave, "people still talk about what you did, standing up to her like that." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied heroism. I just wanted to be left alone in my own garage. "Maybe," Thomas replied, "but it ended up being about more than that, didn't it?" After he left, I considered his words while finishing work on a carburetor. Perhaps he was right. What began as a personal boundary violation had evolved into something larger, a community reclaiming its constitutional protections, a system correcting itself after years of unchecked authority. The following week, I received an invitation to speak at a town council meeting about citizen rights during law enforcement encounters. I hesitated initially, uncomfortable with public speaking, but Marcus convinced me of its importance. "Your experience gives you credibility," he argued. "People will listen in a way they might not listen to a lawyer or academic." The meeting room was packed when I arrived. The new sheriff sat in the front row, his expression neutral but attentive. I spoke simply, without legal jargon, about basic constitutional principles. "Your home is protected," I explained. "Your garage is protected. Your workshop is protected. A badge does not erase these protections. Knowing your rights is not anti-police, it is pro-constitution." Questions followed, thoughtful and practical. One elderly woman asked about allowing officers into her home when they seem friendly. A young man inquired about workshop inspections. A teenager questioned when filming police was permitted. I answered carefully, always returning to fundamental principles. The new sheriff occasionally nodded, particularly when I emphasized the importance of respectful interactions on both sides. Afterward, several residents approached to share their experiences during Sheila's tenure, stories they had been afraid to tell publicly before. The new sheriff waited until the crowd thinned before approaching me. "That was well done," he said, extending his hand. "Clear boundaries make everyone's job easier, including mine." We spoke briefly about the new departmental policies. He mentioned specifically that all deputies now received extensive training on warrant requirements and exceptions. "The garage threshold case is actually part of our training materials now," he added with a slight smile. As weeks passed, normalcy truly returned. The patrol cars no longer slowed when passing my house. The citations for minor infractions ceased. Neighbors waved and stopped to chat by my open garage door without nervousness. One particularly fine autumn day, Raymond visited with a proposal. He suggested creating a community workshop where people could use shared tools and learn mechanical skills. "Your case got me thinking," he explained. "People should feel safe in their creative spaces. Why not make a space where that value is built into the foundation?" The idea resonated. We began planning, involving others who had been affected by Sheila's intrusions. Alina offered gardening classes. Teresa proposed art workshops. The project gave purpose to our shared experience, transforming it from a painful memory into a community resource. The following month, my security cameras captured something unexpected: the new sheriff walking up my driveway. He stopped deliberately at the edge of my garage, clearly visible but not crossing the threshold. "Good morning," he called. "I was wondering if you had a moment to talk about the community workshop project. The department would like to support it." I invited him in explicitly, nodding the careful respect for boundaries. We discussed the project over coffee, finding common ground in community building and mutual respect. Before leaving, he paused at the garage threshold once more. "You know, some officers resented the outcome of your case initially," he admitted. "They felt it restricted their authority. But good policing has never been about unlimited authority. It has always been about earning trust within clear boundaries." That evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant orange, I stood at my garage door contemplating the journey of the past year. The intrusion, the retaliation, the lawsuit, the verdict, all had transformed not just my life but aspects of our community. I reached for the garage door button, lowering it halfway before pausing. Through the narrowing opening, I watched the street where it all began. Then I raised the door again, leaving it open to the cooling evening air. The cameras remained, small sentinels monitoring the perimeter, not from fear anymore but from principle. The door would stay open when I chose to open it, and it would stay closed when I chose to close it. That simple right, the sovereignty of one's own space, had been worth defending, not just for myself, but for everyone who valued freedom within their own four walls. The Constitution lived not just in courtrooms and law books, but in everyday moments and everyday spaces. Even in a simple garage, where an ordinary citizen had drawn a line and said, "This far, no further," and the system eventually had listened.